In this video, we are going to explore the initial concepts that are going to give you a bit of a foundation before you begin programming. I'm going to go through quite a few different slides within this video, 4 different slides. I'd suggest that for each slide you use a separate revision card to get the notes that I'm putting down on each slide on a revision card that you can refer back to later. Okay, so let's get stuck into initial concepts, and we're going to start off by talking about something called the IDE. The IDE is an integrated development environment, and it's where you write, run, and test code. Now you can think of an IDE as being a bit like a toolbox. So if you were a carpenter, you'd have a toolbox that would help you complete your job. If you're a builder, you'd have a series of tools that would help you complete your job. An IDE is essentially a programmer's toolbox. So we're going to define it as such. Within my revision card, I'm going to state that an IDE equals an environment where you can write, run, and test code. And then I'm going to say you can think of it as a programmer's toolbox. It is full of tools that help you to write programs. Okay, so let's start to have a look at an IDE. Now the IDE that we are looking at here is called Replit. It's an online IDE, which at GCSE is the type of IDE that I would suggest Replit is a really good place to start. It's online, so you don't have to install any programs onto your computer. You can almost start writing code and running it immediately. So the IDE has 2 main components that you need to be aware of. The white box on the left-hand side, that is your text editor. So that is where you are going to write the programs. The black box on the right-hand side, that is known as your console, and that is where you are going to run and test code. So I'm going to start off just by writing a really basic program within my IDE. It's not going to be anything special. I'm going to print out hello world. So this is a really basic program. It's a tradition in programming that a hello world program, this program in other words, should be the first program that you write. What I've done is written the program in the text editor, the white box on the left-hand side. When I click the green run button at the top, my program is going to run, and it's going to be run within the console. Printing is output, a concept that we'll have a look at shortly, and the code that I've written is output, is put, in other words, into the console. Okay, so I'm going to pause now, and we're going to start to take a look at the next concept. Move on, and we're going to take a look at the programming concept of output. Now you've probably heard of input and output within computer science before. Input and output within programming, when you're creating a program, means almost the same thing. So we're going to define output quite simply as taking data out of a program. Out of a program. And we can think of input as putting data into the program. So input is putting data into the program, output is taking data out of your program. Now there's quite a few different forms of output that you might use when you're writing programs, but to begin with, the only form of output that you need to be aware of is something known as print. And that essentially allows you to take a value, it could be text, it could be a number, out of the program that you've written and put it into the console. So let's start to have a look at the print statement, the print function. So I'm going to write an example of the print function, and then we'll start to have a look at how we can write it within programming. So the first thing that we do when we are writing a print function is just write down the word print. That is the name of a function. So I'm going to name it as such. I'm just going to say print is a function. We'll look at functions in a bit more detail in a later video, but for now, all we need to think of a function as being is a predefined piece of code. So I'm going to say a function equals a predefined piece of code. Now, whatever is between the brackets of my print function is what is going to be output into the console. So I'm just going to output hello world to begin with into my console. And I'm just going to label that as a value within my notes. I'm going to say value, and I might put, no, I'll just call it a value for now. Okay, so let's head over to our IDE, which is Replit, and we'll just type out an example of print. So here we are in the IDE, and I'm going to start to call the print function. I'm going to start to output something into my console. So I'm going to call print, and then to start with, I'm just going to output hello world. When I click run, I should see that the value, which is hello world, so the value between the brackets of print, is put into the console. And I can have almost any value between those brackets. So I might want to print out, I don't know, 70. When I click run, the value of 70 is output into the console. So we're going to leave the output concept here, the print function here, and we're going to start to take a look at the next concept. Next initial concept that we need to be aware of are data types. Now, data types are quite self-explicit, so we're not going to write down a specific definition of data types. Within programming, we use all sorts of different values. Sometimes we use a piece of text, sometimes we might use a number. We define those different values as data types. There's 5 data types that we need to be aware of in total. So let's start to take a look at those different data types, and then we'll start to look at how we can program using those data types. So the first data type that you need to be aware of, and it's probably the most common data type that you will use when you first start programming, is a string data type. A string data type is an alphanumeric piece of text, but we can think of it quite simply as just being a piece of text. So I'm going to define a string as that. I'm going to say a string is a piece of text. We define a string or declare a string as a value between quotations. So whenever we're programming and we see a value that's between quotations, it is a string, essentially. So a string, I'm just going to put down an example, which can be hello world. The second data type that we need to be aware of, and this is another data type that you use all the time when you start programming, is an integer. Now, an integer you might have heard of in maths before. It means exactly the same thing. It's just a number without any decimal points. So I'm going to declare it as that. I'm going to say an integer equals a number without a decimal point. And an example could be 71, for example. It could be the number 1, it could be the number 100. It could be any value, any number that does not have a decimal point. The third data type that we need to be aware of is a float. And a float is a number with a decimal point. So I'm going to define it as such, a number with a decimal point. And then an example could be, I don't know, 12.1. Any value with a decimal point we would describe as a float. The fourth data type that we need to be aware of, which you will use all the time when you're programming, but you might not necessarily realise that you're using it, and that is a Boolean. Now, a Boolean is a true or false statement. So we can think of a Boolean as being one of two values, true, actually I won't put it between quotations because that confuses things, true or false. And then an example could be true. The only other example could be false. The fifth data type that we need to be aware of, and we'll hardly ever use this data type, is a char, and a char is a single character. So I'm going to define it as such, a single character. So it could be the, I don't know, letter T, for example. It's just a single character between single quotations. So a string is between double quotations, a char or a character is between single quotations. You don't really need to worry about chars too much. You hardly ever use them in programming. So let's head over to our IDE, which is Replit, and we'll just have a play with a few of these examples. So here we are in Replit and our IDE, and I'm just going to print out a few different data types that we've spoken about. So I'm going to start off by printing or outputting a string, and I'm just going to print a hello world. When I run my program, I'm using output so I can see the value, which is a string, which is hello world, has been output into the console. The next data type that we looked at was an integer. So if I just put the number 10 between our output function, I can see that 10 has been output into my console. The third data type that we looked at was a float. So I might put 10.1, for example, run my program again, test my program, maybe is a better way to call it. And I can see 10.1 has been output to my console. The fourth type was a Boolean. We looked at the example of true. Boolean can only be one of two things, true or false, so we use false for this example. I'll test my program again, and there we go. I can see false has been output to the console. And then the fifth data type that we spoke about or looked at was a char. Now we hardly use chars, but a char is just a single character. So I might put the letter, I don't know, M, for example, between single quotations, and there I'm outputting a char, a single character. Okay, so we're going to leave this concept here, and we're going to start to look at our final initial concept, which is arithmetic operators. So the fourth initial concept that we're going to explore is arithmetic operators. We're not going to define arithmetic operators again. We can think of them as the symbols that we use to complete mathematical operations. There's 5 arithmetic operators that you need to be aware of at GCSE. In this video, we're only actually going to focus on 4 of those. The fifth one, which we'll get onto in a second, but we're not going to explore that in any detail today. Okay, so again, we can think of arithmetic operators as the symbols that we use to complete mathematical operations when we are programming. So let's start to have a look at some of those. So the first arithmetic operator that we need to be aware of, quite simply, is plus, and we just use that within addition. So I'm going to say plus, I won't use an equal sign because that confuses things. When we're using the plus symbol, we are using addition. So an example of that could be adding 2 integers together. I might be adding the integer 10 and 10 together to make 20. The second arithmetic operator that we need to be aware of is subtract, and subtract is just subtract, the symbol you're used to using. And an example of subtract could be, I don't know, 10, take 10, keep it really simple. The third arithmetic operator that we need to be aware of, and this is where it starts to separate from what you might be used to, is a forward slash. And we use a forward slash to represent division or dividing. Just say division in this example. And an example of that could be, I don't know, 20 divided by 4. The fourth arithmetic operator that you need to be aware of is multiply. So it might be used to the classic time symbol. Within programming, you use an asterisk, which is a star, and we use that again just to represent multiplying. So I could say, I don't know, 20 times 5. The fifth, which we're not going to explore in this video today, is something known as modular. We use the division symbol to represent modular, but we'll take a look at that in a dedicated video because it's a little bit different to what you might be used to. Okay, so let's head over to our IDE, which is Replit, and start to have a look at how we can use these concepts. So we can use arithmetic operators in all sorts of different parts of our program. In this video, we're just going to look at how we can output different sums equations into our console. So we start off just by using the addition arithmetic operator. I'm going to add the value of 200 to the value of 150. When I run my program, the result of those two values put together is output. Have a look at the other one. So here I am going to, I don't know, we use divide this time. I'm going to divide 200 by 4. I can run it to make sure that it's working as I want it to. Fantastic, it's printed out 50. Might note that it's printed out 0.0 at the end, so rather than printing it out as an integer, it's printed it out as a float data type. The next concept was, or arithmetic operator rather, was multiply, so I might just do 20 multiplied by 5, run it, and there we go. I can see that an integer of 100 has been output to my console. And the final arithmetic operator that we were looking at was subtract, so I might just say 20 subtract 5, run it, and we should see that 15 is output to the console. Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to leave it there with those initial concepts, the IDE, data types, arithmetic operators, and output. They're core to understanding any further concept within programming. So I'd suggest watching this video again if you don't feel 100% confident with those concepts. Make a revision card on each of those concepts and then move on to the next video when we start to explore variables, a slightly more advanced concept within programming.